The purpose of this video today is to talk about what you need to do when you're dealing with inspection issues. So I am finding that a lot of agents don't understand that there is a form that deals with a response for any problems that arose during an inspection. I've seen agents just do addendums, or they just send an email to the agent, to the listing agent, stating what the buyer wants. And that really does not tie into the contract. That's nothing that is a contractual agreement. So there is a form in the MLS that is the resolution of due diligence. And you want to make sure that you put the addendum number on the top here. This is an addendum that gets attached to the contract. This is why we need to use this form. So let's talk about each section of this form. So in the top, like I said, you have to do what addendum number this is. And this form works as both an addendum and a counteroffer. So if your client submits this addendum and asks the seller to do something, and the seller decides to respond, but change something in there, then they would be marking this as a counteroffer. So as a listing agent, you would use this to counter back anything that was to do with the inspections. Be sure that you put the buyer and seller names and the property address as well. Now, in this section, you're going to say, what is going to happen. So is the buyer asking for closing costs to be compensated in lieu of doing repairs? They could apply this to their mortgage financing costs, their closing costs, any prepaids or escrows. So you have to ask the buyer, okay, now that we have this issue, we know that there's a problem here. How do you want to address this? Also, they could have it as just a reduction to the purchase price. So then you're amending the contract to be that price. Third would be the repairs that need to be made by the seller. So if the buyer wants the seller to do the repairs, then you're going to have to itemize exactly what needs to be done. So in item 3, you're going to have to detail exactly what the problem is. So what I do is I take the home inspection and I basically itemize the things that the inspector said. Now, most home inspectors will do a summary page that shows all the things that they found that were of concern. So you could use just that page attached with this, and it references exactly what the inspector said. And then you want to give a remedy. What exactly do you want the seller to do? So if there is a leak in the roof, you don't want to just say, fix the leak in the roof, because if there's damage that was done from that leak in the roof, you're going to want that damage fixed as well. So you have to be very detailed on exactly what the buyer is asking the seller to do. If you're not, then don't expect it to be done the way the buyer wants, because the seller, they're not going to guess what the buyer wants. And most likely they're going to do the minimal amount. So you want to be very detailed on what the problem is and then what the remedy is of that. So I would stipulate that the roof needs to be repaired and that the sheetrock that was damaged be replaced and repainted, resurfaced and repainted. Make it very detailed so that there's no question as to what the seller needs to do and what they're agreeing to. Now, in the next part of this form, it talks about what happens if the seller doesn't do that. So if the buyer is asking the seller to do repairs, what if the seller doesn't do it? Which that happens. Maybe you're getting close to closing, you do a walkthrough, and you realize that they didn't fix that problem with the roof, or they didn't fix the sheetrock. So the buyer has to decide how they're going to proceed if the repairs are not completed before settlement. So in section 3.1, in A, the buyer can cancel the REPSI and in addition, get the return of the earnest money. Or in B, they may go ahead and complete the purchase, but then pursue any legal activity afterwards, any remedies by law. So what if they don't do the repairs? So they can choose to delay the closing by requesting for an extension of the settlement date due to the fact that the seller did not make the repairs that they had agreed to, and they're in violation of the contract for. Secondly, the buyer can cancel the contract, and the seller will have to pay an equal amount of the earnest money back to the buyer. So if it's a $5,000 earnest money that the buyer put up, the seller is going to have to give them $5,000 more in addition to the earnest money being released. That's because they defaulted. They did not do what they agreed to do in the contract. Also, the buyer could ask for title to hold that money, whatever the cost of the repairs would be, to hold that in escrow until the repairs are made. And so if there's, let's say it needs a new roof on the house, and the roofer is not able to get out there until after closing. Well, that money could be held in escrow to be specifically given to that contractor once the repairs are made. You need to check with your title. You need to check with lender to make sure that that's going to be acceptable. And the last remedy is that the buyer can complete the settlement. Just go ahead and go through with everything and then take the seller to court to get those repairs either funded or done. Now, part 4 of this form is really important because it's saying that if you mark this letter A, that the buyer due diligence is not waived. So if you are at the end of your due diligence period, you don't need to worry about this. But let's say you have a 2-week due diligence period. And within the first week is when you find the issues and negotiate the connecting everything there. So then you have an additional week of your due diligence. And a home inspection is not the only thing that you're looking for with due diligence. So the buyer has an additional week. You don't want to waive the due diligence period at this point because maybe they're checking into zoning or issues with the HOA or anything like that. So you want to make sure that you check the box that says it's not waived. Now, again, if you're at the end of your due diligence period, it's not a big deal. Don't worry about marking that. But that's what that due diligence condition item is about. And then, of course, you want to make sure you have your date and time to accept this. Be sure that if you're in your due diligence period, that you're not doing this at the 11th hour, all right? Your deadline ends at 5 p.m. Mountain Time. So be sure to get this agreed upon prior to, at least a day before. If you have to do it several hours before, just get it done and get an acceptance or counter rejection from that seller, because just because your buyer is requesting something doesn't mean the seller is going to agree to it. So if you don't have that agreement done before 5 o'clock on the due diligence deadline, then it's a moot point. You have to keep moving forward. You've already passed your time. So as a buyer's agent, it's your responsibility to make sure that all of this is taken care of and signed off on prior to 5 o'clock on the due diligence deadline. So here's some important tips. Be sure that your buyer does all of their inspections prior to the due diligence deadline, and submit that resolution of due diligence before the deadline. Get that seller's signature before 5 p.m. on that date. And if the buyer's not happy with the results of the inspection, or the seller's not willing to rectify the issues in any way, then the buyer has until 5 p.m. on that deadline to cancel. So if you're getting close, you may go ahead and just have the buyer sign a cancellation to deliver to the listing agent if you don't get a response within the time frame that you need.